Good morning, students. In this class, we'll be discussing the literature of the Puritan Age in general, and we'll be discussing about these two particular writers, John Milton and John Bunyan. First of all, about the literature in Caroline Age. As you know, the literature of the Caroline Age took shape against a background of struggle and change. We have already discussed these conflicts in the last classes. All those age old ideals of society and even the concepts of church, the concept of monarchy got crumbled during this period. And there was no fixed standard of literary criticism for writers to look up to. And this Puritan literature is completely different from Elizabethan literature. In Elizabethan literature, we see this unity in spirit by patriotism, the elements of humanism, and even romantic strains. While in Puritan literature, we see the depiction of serious concepts, life is seen as a moral struggle, and also this period had far less poetic output when compared to Elizabethan period. First of all, we will look into metaphysical poets. The term metaphysical was a pejorative term used by Dr. Samuel Johnson to describe John Donne's poetry and the poetry of others like George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Thomas Carew, etc. So the basic features of these poetry included the subject matters taken from religious and amatory subjects, and it was mainly lyrical, and it made use of scientific discoveries. It had all those unusual images and paradoxes, and the use of what is known as metaphysical conceit. So this school of poetry is rather complex and poses a challenge to readers. And then you have Cavalier poets. They are also known by the name Sons of Ben. They are all often aristocrats and they supported the monarchy of Charles I. So, this court of Charles I were known as Cavaliers. The important poets are Ben Jonson, Robert Herrick, Thomas Carew, Richard Lovelace. So, their main aim was to entertain rather than provoke their audiences. Their major aim was to give out entertainment. So they employed a conversational style that followed natural speech patterns, and they used elaborate conceits or complicated metaphors just like metaphysical poets. So the poems written by these poets were generally light-hearted, witty, and highly polished verse. As I said earlier, Cavalier poets, it is used to denote a group of poets closely associated with the court of Charles I. They were known as Sons of Ben because they spent a lot of time with Ben Jonson, after whose poetry they modeled their own. So these are the features of their poetry. It was highly influenced by the classical Greek and Roman style, and usually the subject matter revolved around romantic love, and they used classical women's names in their poetry, and they expressed a philosophy or theme which was called carpe diem or seize the day. And coming to the literature of the Puritan age, the temperament, we understand that the temperament or the general characteristics of their writings of these writers completely changed during this period. And the function of Puritan writers was mainly to transform a mysterious God into someone who is close to human beings. Mysterious in the sense that was seen as, as a person separated from the world. So here, Puritan writers made an attempt to transform a mysterious God into someone who is close to human beings and to make him more relevant to the universe. and mainly their aim was to glorify God. So Puritan writing reflected the character and scope of the reading public, which was at that time literate and well grounded in religion. So these were the common themes in early Puritan writing. We see these elements of idealism and at the same time pragmaticism. Idealism in the levels of religion and politics, and pragmaticism, we see these elements of practicality and purposiveness at the same time. So, coming to the major writers during this period, as I said earlier, these are the two major writers. One is John Milton and the other one is John Bunyan. So, we'll start with John Milton. John Milton spent greater part of his life in Caroline Age, and he had to go through this shameful experience of living as a Puritan in the Restoration times. He had a key role as a propagandist during Commonwealth period. And later he became blind, he became poor, and in his last days he was alone. He spent his last days as a blind, poor, and a lonely person in an obscure village in Buckinghamshire. And he had to face all these allegations of being double standard. And this is what Wordsworth told about Milton. Milton was like a star and dwelt apart. He neither founded a school nor followed one. None imitated him, and he imitated no one. And in his poetry, we see this strange dovetailing, strange mixture of Puritan and sensuous classic strain and technical perfection. At times, he was even called sensuous Puritan. You know that it is something like opposite or extremes, sensuous and at the same time Puritan. So his early poems were written during his university days. This is his first poem on the morning of Christ's nativity. And he has this companion poems, Le Allegro and Il Penseroso. And he has written a pastoral elegy titled Lycidas. And he has also written prose during his middle years. But his last years is considered golden in terms of the works which came out during that period. We have the monumental work Paradise Lost and its sequel Paradise Regained. He has also written a choral drama which is named Samson Agonistes, which is modeled on Greek drama and shared no feature with the Restoration period. And he has also written sonnets. He has only written 23 sonnets, but he deserves special mention as a sonneteer. Each sonnets were on different subjects. It was not in sequence, but it introduced Petrarchan sonnet to English. So these are the four phases of Milton's works. The first one, the college period. Second, the Horton period. Third, the period of religious and political controversies. And lastly and most importantly, the period of the great epics. First of all, about the college period. It was during this period he wrote many poems but are of little significance. But this particular poem, titled The Ode on the Morning of Christ's Nativity, stands apart. It is an exception. It is written on a biblical subject but glows with imagination, and it contains lots of pagan imageries. And here we also see a fusion of the Renaissance and Reformation influences. And then comes the next period, the Horton period, which contains four minor poems, Le Allegro, Il Penseroso, Comus, and Lycidas. And here we understand that he began to write chiefly under the influence of the learning and art of the Renaissance. And we also see his movement towards Puritanism. Puritan element becomes dominant during this period. At earlier stage, it was subordinate, but now it gradually gained its strength and depth. L'Allegro and Il Penseroso present charming contrasted pictures of man, nature, and art. The first poem is in the mood of gladness, whereas the second in that of melancholy. And what is remarkable in these poems is the fact that there is little that is characteristically Puritan. And in fact, there are great deal of unpuritan elements too. So here, you know that Puritanism completely, they have this complete aversion to pleasure. So in these poems, we see that the poet dwells frankly upon the pleasures of romance and rustic sports. So that is why I said earlier that we see unpuritan elements in these poems which came out during the Horton period. Commerce is one of the best example of mask. It also belongs to this Renaissance. However, it was in Lycidas we see this element of Puritanism. We have a Puritanism which is political and ecclesiastical as well as spiritual and ethical. And here we see Milton attacking the corrupt church and all those clergies. And then comes next period, the period of religious and political controversies. So in his 41st year, Milton willingly got himself into this fierce controversies of the hour. To use his own words, by choosing to do that, he said, he embarked on a troubled sea of noises. For the next 20 years, Milton continued actively as a writer of prose and was involved in political and religious controversies. He thus turned from poetry entirely, and this was a great loss to poetry. And then comes this great period, the period of great epics. Eventually, after moving into prose, eventually he turned back to poetry. And here he produced this great epic, the monumental work Paradise Lost. It is considered to be the greatest English epic. So, this epic poem is written in blank verse and it talks about the fall of Adam and Eve from the grace of God. And here, what makes it more interesting is the fact that there is this powerful and sympathetic characterization of Satan. We see a charismatic leader in the form of Satan. So this work, we see this complete fusion of Renaissance and Reformation elements. And the next one, the sequel of Paradise Lost, it was titled Paradise Regained. It was dominated by Puritanism and it also talked about the spiritual conflict between good and evil. And then he has this choral drama, Samson Agonistus, which takes the form of a classical art to the treatment of a biblical subject. So Milton actually represents the highest and the complete type of Puritanism. However, the culture of the Renaissance was never totally wiped out from his works. We see this puritanical bend of his mind. In his poetry, the puritanical strain is apparent in following manners, in the choice of religious subjects, especially in the later poems, best example being Paradise Lost, and the sense of responsibility and moral exaltation, and his fondness for preaching and lecturing, which in Paradise Lost it is actually a positive weakness. This fondness of preaching and lecturing becomes a positive weakness, becomes an advantage in the case of Paradise Lost. And we also see this narrowness of outlook, which is strongly puritanical, which is seen in his outburst against his opponents, as you see in Lycidas, and in his belief regarding the inferiority of women. We see this narrowness of outlook and his scorn for the miscellaneous ramble. However, we can also trace this Renaissance elements too in his love for beauty, his classical learning, and his use of classical forms of poetry. And Milton, as a sonneteer, as I said earlier, he has written only 23 sonnets. He was a minor poet of sonnet. And his two sonnets on his blindness and on the late massacre in Piedmont are the best. And 18 of them were written during the period 1645 to 1658, which is marked as the period of his prose writing. And latter sonnets of Milton are the most personal. It contains emotional moments. And his sonnets are modeled on Italian sonnets. Milton characteristically made use of the form of sonnet at a time when its vogue was almost past, and it was not at all popular. His formal model is not the English sonnet, as I said earlier. He uses Petrarchan sonnet. And on the basis of their themes, Milton's sonnets can be divided into three categories. Firstly, there is a group of sonnets which dealt with great public events and personalities. The sonnets to Cromwell, to Fairfax, are, which are the ones which come under this category. And secondly, there are sonnets which express personal emotion of the poet on his having arrived at the age of 23. It is one such sonnet, and two sonnets on his blindness, and one written in the memory of his second wife comes under this category. They combine a poignant pathos with an earnest ethical and religious idealism. Thirdly, there are sonnets of addresses to personalities like Laws, Skinner, Edward Lawrence, Lady Margaret Key, etc. And also, it contains a sonnet expressing his grief at the death of his second wife. So, from the above account, it is very clear that Milton widened the scope of the sonnet. Earlier, sonnet was used as a medium of expressing only the emotion of love. But Milton used this sonnet form to express his deeply felt emotions on different subjects like contemporary politics, religion, public figures, and womanhood. So, as I said earlier, Milton modeled his sonnets on Petrarchan form, but even then he did not follow it blindly. And to conclude, these are the words of W.J. Long. He says, this Italian form of verse, nearly to the point of perfection. In them, he seldom wrote of love, the usual subject with his predecessors, but of patriotism, duty, music, and subjects of political interest suggested by the struggle into which England was drifting. Now we'll move to the next writer, John Bunyan. He was an English minister and a preacher. He served in Parliament army and he was constantly in touch with Puritan teachings. And he questioned all religious authority except that of individual conscience. He was fully a Puritan by 1655, and these are his major works: The Pilgrim's Progress, which is an expression of the Puritan religious outlook, and Grace Abounding, which is a spiritual autobiography, which was written during imprisonment during Restoration period. And then there is this work titled The Holy War, which is an allegory. So, coming to his prominent work, The Pilgrim's Progress, it was published in two parts in 1678 and 1684. And here we get a symbolic vision of a good man's pilgrimage through life. The major protagonist is named Christian. So in part 1, we see this author's dream of the trials and adventures of Christian. So Christian here becomes an everyman figure, and he travels from his home. He moves through the city of destruction, finally to reach this celestial city. And in part 2, we see this journey taken over by his wife, Christiana. Christian's wife, Christiana, and their sons, as well as their neighbor, Mercy, attempt to join him in the celestial city. So basically, this work is a Puritan conversion narrative, and Calvinistic theology provides a firm underlying ground plan. It is homely yet dignified biblical prose, and it has some of the qualities of a folktale. And it has these elements of humor and realistic portrayals of minor characters, which actually anticipates the 18th century novel. It is known as a precursor of 18th century novel. So this is a plan of this road from city of destruction to the celestial city as seen in this work. So here I end my lecture. I hope it is clear. Thank you. Have a nice day.